Hello and welcome. Tonight, we will quietly explore a piece of history from America's past. We will learn about a time called the first cocaine epidemic, which happened in the 1890s. If you enjoy calm historical stories like this one, please consider subscribing. It helps to keep these gentle histories coming. In the late 1800s, cocaine was not illegal. People did not know all the dangers it could bring. It was often sold in pharmacies, and sometimes even in drinks. Doctors sometimes gave it to patients for headaches, tiredness, or other small pains. Many people believed it was safe when used carefully. Cocaine first became popular in the United States after it was introduced from Europe. Some companies started adding it to medicines. Some even sold it as a powder that people could sniff or mix into liquids. It was seen as a way to feel more awake or energetic. At first, the drug was mostly used by adults. People thought it could help them work harder or feel stronger. Some even gave it to children for minor illnesses. This was long before there were rules about medicine safety. Over time, the drug started to spread to more parts of society. It appeared in newspapers, advertisements, and medical journals. Many people began to talk about its exciting effects. This led to more curiosity and more people trying it. As more people began using cocaine, different kinds of products appeared. Some were powders and some were liquids. There were even syrups and tonics that claimed to make people feel stronger, more alert, or happier. Many of these products were sold in stores or pharmacies. People believed they were safe because they were made by companies that seemed trustworthy. Doctors played a role in the spread of cocaine. At that time, medical knowledge about addiction was limited. Some doctors prescribed it for toothaches, for fatigue, or for even small complaints like colds. Cocaine was thought to improve mood and energy. Some doctors even used it as a local anesthetic for dental work or minor surgeries. People trusted the advice of their doctors, so many started using it without fear. One of the most famous early products that contained cocaine was a popular beverage. It was created as a refreshing drink that people could enjoy any time of day. At first, it was marketed as something healthy and invigorating. People drank it in homes, at social gatherings, and even in restaurants. Sales grew quickly. The drink's popularity contributed to a larger social trend. People began to associate cocaine with productivity and energy. Some workers used it to stay awake longer during long shifts. Students and professionals sometimes tried it to focus on tasks. Society had not yet recognized the risks of long-term use. The spread of cocaine was not limited to adults. Some children were given products containing it. Parents sometimes gave it to them for small illnesses, teething, or sleep problems. At that time, there were very few rules about what medicines could be sold to children. People trusted the labels and advertisements. As use increased, problems slowly started to appear. Some people became dependent on cocaine. Dependence meant that the body and mind began to need the drug to function normally. Those who used it heavily often found that it affected their behavior. They might become more restless, anxious, or irritable. Some lost jobs or had trouble keeping up with daily responsibilities. Newspapers began to report on these problems. Stories described people who had started using cocaine for simple reasons but then became addicted. These articles often warned about the dangers, but were sometimes sensationalized, making the topic seem shocking or extreme. This helped the public become more aware of the growing issue. At the same time, cocaine use became associated with certain social groups. It was sometimes linked to musicians, performers, and others in nightlife communities. This created a stereotype in newspapers and magazines. These stories added to the concern among more cautious members of society. Researchers and medical professionals began studying cocaine more carefully. They noted that repeated use could lead to serious physical and mental health problems. Some patients experienced insomnia, weight loss, or changes in personality. Medical studies started to show that the drug was not safe for casual or long-term use. Gradually, attitudes toward cocaine began to shift. Communities started to talk about regulating the drug. Local authorities and politicians considered laws to limit its sale. Some cities began banning advertisements or sales to minors. These early efforts marked the beginning of more formal drug regulation in the United States. Despite growing concern, cocaine remained accessible for many years. Pharmacies still sold products containing it, and new users continued to experiment. Many people did not fully understand the risks. Addiction, social problems, and health concerns grew slowly but steadily. By the end of the 1890s, the first signs of a national problem were clear. Newspapers, doctors, and families increasingly recognized that cocaine could be dangerous. Discussions about the drug appeared in public meetings and community gatherings. This was the start of a broader effort to protect people from widespread use. The story of America's first cocaine epidemic shows how quickly a substance can move from being accepted and common to being recognized as risky. It was a time when curiosity, medical advice, and advertising all combined to create a wave of use. The lessons learned helped shape future laws about drugs, safety, and public health. Even though cocaine is now illegal and tightly controlled, remembering this period helps us understand the past. It reminds us that new products, especially ones sold as safe or helpful, need careful study. People in the 1890s did not have the information we have today, so they relied on trust and experience. This sometimes led to problems that were difficult to reverse. As cocaine use grew, certain industries and social scenes contributed to its spread. Pharmacies sold it widely and often without restriction. People could buy small doses for personal use. Some stores sold tonics, powders, and syrups that contained cocaine. Labels often described it as safe, energizing, or even helpful for minor illnesses. Advertising encouraged people to try it freely, without warning of risks. Doctors continued to play a role in both popularizing and studying the drug. Some believed cocaine could treat nervous conditions or digestive issues. Others used it as a stimulant to keep patients awake or alert. Medical journals sometimes published articles praising cocaine's effects. At the same time, some physicians began to report cases where repeated use caused addiction, anxiety, or health problems. The recreational use of cocaine expanded during this period. Performers, musicians, and some socialites began experimenting with it. Nightclubs and theaters sometimes saw frequent cocaine use. People reported feeling more energetic or confident after taking it. The social aspect of cocaine use made it seem normal or even fashionable in certain circles. Cocaine also began to intersect with other substances. Some people mixed it with alcohol or opiates. This combination could increase the intensity of effects, but also raise the risks. Stories of negative outcomes began to appear in newspapers and medical reports. People started to recognize that using too much cocaine could lead to serious health issues or unpredictable behavior. In medicine, cocaine remained an anesthetic and stimulant. Surgeons sometimes used it for minor procedures because it could numb specific areas of the body. Dentists used it to reduce pain during extractions. Even as warnings about addiction increased, the drug retained a reputation for usefulness in controlled doses. Advertising was a major factor in the spread of cocaine. Companies promoted tonics, powders, and drinks in newspapers, magazines, and store windows. Ads often claimed that these products could increase energy, cure fatigue, or improve mood. There were few rules regulating claims about health benefits. People trusted the marketing, and many tried products repeatedly. By the mid-1890s, stories of addiction were becoming more common. Some people could no longer stop using cocaine once they began. They experienced cravings, restlessness, and irritability. Families noticed changes in loved ones who became dependent. Society began to view heavy use as a problem that needed attention. Cocaine use was sometimes linked with poverty and difficult working conditions. Laborers, including miners and factory workers, occasionally used it to stay awake during long hours or to cope with fatigue. Employers sometimes overlooked or even encouraged use because it seemed to improve productivity. This contributed to further spread among working class communities. In urban areas, cocaine use could intersect with crime and disorder. Some reports suggested that people under the influence of cocaine acted unpredictably or aggressively. Law enforcement occasionally became involved, though many cases were handled informally or quietly. Public concern increased as stories about dangerous behavior circulated in newspapers. Some regions took steps to restrict cocaine sales. City councils or local governments sometimes banned advertisements or limited sales to certain stores. Pharmacists faced new responsibilities to avoid selling excessive amounts. These efforts were uneven, and enforcement varied widely from place to place. Researchers continued to study cocaine's effects. Early scientific reports described both short-term stimulation and long-term health risks. Some users experienced insomnia, weight loss, or rapid heartbeat. Mental changes were also observed, including mood swings, anxiety, and paranoia in some cases. These findings gradually reached a wider public audience through newspapers and medical journals. By the late 1890s, awareness of addiction was increasing. Doctors, pharmacists, and journalists began warning about the dangers of repeated use. Some communities organized discussions about public health and safe use. Despite these warnings, cocaine remained accessible. Many people did not fully grasp the seriousness of addiction or the risks of long-term use. In the medical community, debates emerged about regulation. Some professionals argued for stricter controls to prevent abuse. Others believed that cocaine had legitimate uses and should remain available with caution. This tension reflected the broader uncertainty about how to handle drugs that were both useful and potentially dangerous. Social attitudes toward cocaine were complex. Among some social circles, using the drug was still seen as fashionable or exciting. In other circles, especially among families and religious communities, it was considered risky and inappropriate. Newspapers and magazines reflected this diversity of opinion, often presenting both warnings and sensational stories. Education about the risks of cocaine slowly began. Schools and community groups sometimes held lectures or printed pamphlets. These materials described symptoms of addiction, possible health effects, and stories of people whose lives had been negatively affected. Public education was limited and uneven, but it laid the foundation for more organized efforts in the next decades. Cocaine's spread intersected with other social trends, alcohol prohibition movements, changing labor practices, and urbanization all shaped the environment in which the drug circulated. Some people saw cocaine as a tool to cope with long working hours, while others worried it threatened social stability. Despite growing knowledge of harm, some manufacturers continued to produce and sell cocaine products. Profits were high, and consumer demand persisted. Some companies began reformulating products to reduce risks, while others marketed new tonics and powders with promises of health and vitality. Medical publications increasingly described specific cases of addiction. Doctors wrote about patients who started with small doses but gradually needed more to feel normal. These case studies included descriptions of withdrawal symptoms, restlessness, and social difficulties. They were among the earliest scientific records of cocaine dependence in the United States. Cocaine use was also observed among artists, performers, and writers. Some believed it enhanced creativity or focus. Others experienced negative consequences, including health problems and erratic behavior. These patterns contributed to a growing public awareness that cocaine was not just a medical substance, but a social phenomenon with both appeal and risk. By the end of the 1890s, public discussion about cocaine had intensified. Newspapers, medical journals, and public meetings reflected concern about widespread use. Communities began to explore ways to control the sale and distribution of the drug. Pharmacists faced new expectations to monitor purchases and advise customers. At the same time, cocaine retained a place in medicine. Surgeons and dentists continued to use it for anesthesia, and some physicians still prescribed it for certain conditions. Research continued to focus on understanding both benefits and dangers, contributing to the emerging field of addiction medicine. In urban neighborhoods, stories of cocaine use became part of daily life. Families, employers, and social organizations encountered the drug in various ways. Some tried to discourage use, while others tolerated it as part of social or work routines. The widespread availability of cocaine meant that exposure was common across many social and economic groups. Even as problems emerged, cultural attitudes were slow to change. Some advertisements still promoted cocaine tonics as energizing or refreshing. Some doctors still recommended it for minor complaints. Public awareness increased, but knowledge about the risks was uneven, and many people continued to experiment with the drug. The first cocaine epidemic was shaped by trust in medicine, advertising, and social trends. People were curious, and products were widely available. Cocaine became part of daily life for some, whether in medicine, workplace use, or social settings. This period marked the start of public recognition that drugs could be both helpful and harmful, and that unrestricted use could have consequences. In many cities, pharmacies were the main point where people could obtain cocaine. They stocked powders, syrups, and tonics. Customers could ask for advice from the pharmacist or buy over the counter. Sometimes people bought it for energy, sometimes for minor illnesses, and sometimes out of curiosity. There were no strict rules on how much a person could purchase. Doctors continued to use cocaine in their practices. Dentists applied it to numb the mouth during extractions. Surgeons sometimes used it to control pain during minor procedures. Physicians occasionally prescribed it to patients with headaches, fatigue, or nervous complaints. Reports of addiction started to appear in medical journals, but many doctors still considered it safe in small doses. In social settings, cocaine began appearing more frequently. People attending theaters, music halls, or social clubs might encounter others using it. Some performers used it to stay alert during long shows or to maintain energy. This led to wider awareness of the drug among urban populations. People could see it being used without serious immediate consequences, which contributed to curiosity and experimentation. Advertising played a major role in spreading cocaine use. Companies promoted products with promises of increased strength, alertness, and general well-being. Print advertisements were common in newspapers, magazines, and on store windows. People trusted these claims because there were few regulations requiring proof of safety or effectiveness. Some families gave cocaine containing products to children. Parents sometimes believed the tonics or powders could help with teething, colds, or sleep problems. Safety warnings were almost non-existent. Children were exposed to the drug because adults trusted the labels and medical guidance. The early reports of addiction showed that repeated use could lead to dependence. Some users needed more of the drug over time to feel alert or energetic. Restlessness, irritability, and changes in mood were common. Families noticed these changes and sometimes sought advice from doctors or pharmacists. In some workplaces, cocaine use was tolerated or even encouraged. Laborers with long hours in factories, mines, or railroads sometimes used it to stay awake. employers occasionally saw benefits in productivity. Some workers depended on it to manage fatigue. This contributed to the spread among certain social classes. In cities, law enforcement became aware of problems related to cocaine use. Reports of erratic or aggressive behavior began to appear. Some cases involved theft or disorder. While serious criminal charges were uncommon, there was growing concern about the social impact of widespread use. Medical researchers continued to study the effects of cocaine. Reports included observations of physical symptoms such as weight loss, rapid heartbeat, and insomnia. Mental changes such as anxiety, paranoia, and agitation were also recorded. Early studies noted that repeated use could cause significant health issues and changes in behavior. Regulation began slowly. Some cities and states started introducing limits on sales. Local authorities sometimes banned advertisements or required pharmacists to monitor purchases. Enforcement was inconsistent, but these early measures were steps toward broader control of cocaine distribution. Cultural attitudes were mixed. Some social groups saw cocaine use as exciting or fashionable. Others, particularly religious and family communities, saw it as dangerous or inappropriate. Newspapers and journals often reported both positive stories about the drug and warnings about addiction or negative consequences. Public education was limited but emerging. Lectures, pamphlets, and newspaper articles occasionally warned about the risks of cocaine. Families, teachers, and community leaders tried to inform children and adults about potential dangers. Awareness grew slowly, but the reach of these messages was uneven. By the late 1890s, cocaine use had spread across a wide range of social groups. People in cities, towns, and some rural areas had access to it. Pharmacies and medical professionals continued to provide products containing cocaine. Advertising encouraged curiosity. Users included men, women, children, laborers, professionals, and performers. Some doctors began recommending caution more openly. Reports of addiction, mental health changes, and physical symptoms reached medical journals and newspapers. Communities discussed ways to prevent abuse, though products remained widely available. In urban neighborhoods, families noticed cocaine use among relatives or neighbors. Some tried to intervene while others tolerated it for minor complaints or fatigue. Stories about erratic or harmful behavior increased public concern. Newspapers reported cases in detail, sometimes focusing on unusual incidents involving users who became addicted. Some early reformers began to push for more formal laws. They suggested restricting sales, requiring licenses for pharmacists, or limiting advertising. Their efforts reflected growing awareness that the drug was not harmless. These proposals were debated in medical and public forums. In social environments, cocaine use continued to intersect with nightlife, entertainment, and labor. Musicians, performers, and students sometimes experimented with it. Workers used it to remain alert during long shifts. This meant that exposure to the drug was present in many areas of daily life. Medical research continued to observe the effects on the body and mind. Studies recorded cases where repeated use led to dependence, insomnia, anxiety, and changes in appetite. Withdrawal symptoms were documented, including restlessness and irritability. Physicians began using these observations to advise patients more cautiously. Some pharmacists started recommending smaller doses or providing warnings to buyers. Others continued selling products freely, relying on customer trust and demand. Advertising sometimes shifted slightly, highlighting controlled use or safe dosages, though these measures were limited and inconsistent. In certain workplaces, supervisors noticed patterns of use. Laborers who used cocaine regularly sometimes became dependent and needed it to function. Employers were aware that workers might use it to maintain productivity. This created a social environment where cocaine use was sometimes tolerated or overlooked. In education and community settings, teachers and leaders began to notice the effects on children and young people. Some children were given cocaine containing products for minor illnesses. Awareness campaigns started to point out the potential risks, though access to accurate information was limited. Throughout the decade, newspapers played a significant role. They reported cases of addiction, social problems, and medical observations. Some reports were sensational, others factual. Readers began to develop an understanding that cocaine use could lead to serious consequences if misused. Public debate about regulation grew. Some city councils and state legislatures began discussing laws to limit sales, restrict advertising, or require pharmacists to track purchases. Early proposals reflected concerns about public health and safety. Implementation varied widely, and enforcement was not always consistent. Doctors continued to use cocaine in medical practice. Anesthesia for dental procedures remained common, and some physicians prescribed it for specific complaints. Reports of addiction and health problems were increasingly recognized, and caution was advised. In social circles, cocaine remained present in nightlife and entertainment. Some performers used it to maintain energy during long events. Others experimented socially. These patterns contributed to the broader perception of cocaine as both useful and risky. Families observed changes in behavior among users. Dependence became apparent in some cases, with restlessness, irritability, and altered moods. People began consulting doctors for advice, and some attempted to limit access to children or vulnerable family members. Advertising continued to play a role in encouraging use. Companies promoted tonics, powders, and syrups with claims of energy, strength, and well-being. Safety warnings were minimal. Consumers relied on labels and trust in medical or commercial authority. Medical reports documented symptoms including insomnia, rapid heartbeat, and weight loss. Mental effects such as anxiety, irritability, and agitation were recorded. Repeated use increased the risk of dependency. Physicians began to report cases systematically, helping to build early knowledge about addiction. By the end of the 1890s, cocaine use had reached many levels of society. Adults, children, workers, and performers had all been exposed. Public awareness of risks was growing, though access remained widespread. Efforts to regulate sales and distribution were beginning to take shape, marking a turning point in the management of the drug. Cocaine use in homes became more common during the 1890s. Parents sometimes kept tonics and powders for their own use or for minor illnesses in the family. Children could be given small doses for conditions like colds or teething discomfort. This practice contributed to exposure at a young age, though most people did not recognize the risks. Pharmacies remained central to the availability of cocaine. Customers could purchase syrups, powders, and tonics easily. Pharmacists often provided guidance based on their knowledge at the time. Some recommended small doses for energy or minor complaints, while others noticed signs of overuse and tried to advise caution. Doctors continued to experiment with cocaine in medical practice. It was used for anesthesia in dental procedures and minor surgeries. Physicians sometimes prescribed it for fatigue, nervous disorders, or headaches. As reports of addiction grew, some doctors became more cautious. Others still recommended the drug because it appeared effective in controlled doses. Advertising strongly influenced public perception. Newspaper ads, posters, and magazine promotions described cocaine products as energizing, restorative, and safe. Consumers trusted these claims. Few warnings existed regarding the risks of dependence or long-term use. Marketing helped to normalize use and encouraged experimentation. In urban workplaces, cocaine became part of daily routines. Laborers in factories, railroads, and mines sometimes used it to stay awake during long hours. Employers occasionally tolerated use because it seemed to improve alertness. Some workers developed dependence needing the drug to maintain productivity. Cocaine also appeared in recreational settings. Social gatherings, theaters, and music halls sometimes saw cocaine use among patrons and performers. People experimented for social reasons or to maintain energy during late events. These patterns helped cocaine reach a wider audience beyond medical or labor contexts. Medical journals started reporting addiction more systematically. Case studies documented restlessness, irritability, mood changes, insomnia, and appetite loss. These observations showed that repeated use could lead to dependency. Some physicians began warning patients and families about risks, but understanding remained limited. Cultural perceptions varied. In some circles, cocaine was fashionable or exciting. Among families, religious communities, and educators, it was often considered dangerous. Newspapers reflected this mixed view, reporting both stories of success and warnings about harm. Public concern grew, particularly in urban areas with higher exposure. Children were a vulnerable group. Parents sometimes gave them tonics or powders containing cocaine. Schools and community leaders began noticing signs of use. Early educational efforts started, including lectures and pamphlets warning about potential dangers. These efforts reached some families, but were inconsistent. Cocaine's effects in the body and mind became more widely recognized. Reports included rapid heartbeat, insomnia, weight loss, and irritability. Mental symptoms such as anxiety, agitation, and mood swings were documented. Withdrawal symptoms became evident in cases of heavy use, including restlessness and discomfort. In some neighborhoods, law enforcement began to notice problems. Cocaine use occasionally led to minor crimes or disorderly conduct. Some reports involved theft or aggressive behavior, though severe legal consequences were rare. Concern about social stability contributed to early discussions about regulation. Cities and states began exploring ways to control cocaine. Some introduced laws limiting sales or requiring licenses for pharmacists. Advertising was occasionally restricted. Enforcement varied widely, but these early regulations marked a shift from free access to more controlled distribution. Employers observed patterns of dependence in workplaces. Laborers using cocaine regularly sometimes needed it to function or maintain energy. Supervisors occasionally noticed changes in behavior or reliability. These observations contributed to awareness of broader social consequences. Doctors continued to refine medical use. Dental procedures and minor surgeries still involved cocaine for anesthesia. Some physicians prescribed it cautiously for specific complaints, while also monitoring for signs of dependence. Medical knowledge about long-term effects was growing slowly. Social exposure remained widespread. Performers, musicians, and students sometimes experimented with cocaine. Social settings, entertainment venues, and labor environments allowed people to observe others using the drug. This visibility contributed to curiosity and experimentation. Advertising continued to promote cocaine products widely. Promises of energy, health, and vitality remained common. Few warnings about long-term risks appeared on labels or in ads. Public trust in brands and medical recommendations helped sustain sales and experimentation. Medical research focused on case studies and observations of addiction. Physicians recorded symptoms including insomnia, weight loss, rapid heartbeat, mood swings, and agitation. Repeated use often led to dependency, withdrawal discomfort, and social problems. Some studies emphasized the need for caution in prescribing or selling the drug. Families and communities began taking notice. Some tried to limit access for children or vulnerable relatives. Others tolerated small doses for minor complaints. Stories of erratic behavior or addiction circulated, increasing awareness of potential risks. Cocaine remained accessible in pharmacies, medical practices, and social venues. Regulatory efforts were growing but uneven. Some areas implemented strict measures, others continued free distribution. the drug's presence in daily life persisted despite early warnings. Public education developed slowly. Pamphlets, lectures, and newspaper articles attempted to inform people about addiction and health risks. Teachers and community leaders participated when possible. Knowledge reached only parts of the population, leaving widespread gaps in awareness. Medical debate continued about appropriate use. Some physicians argued for complete restriction, others emphasized careful, controlled application. The tension reflected the dual nature of cocaine, useful in medicine, but potentially harmful in daily use. Laborers and workers used cocaine to cope with fatigue. Long shifts, heavy physical work, and limited rest made the drug appealing. Employers sometimes encouraged use for productivity. Dependence became common among some workers, illustrating the social consequences of widespread availability. Urban neighborhoods saw cocaine use in households and social settings. Children, adults, and performers all had some exposure. Families noticed changes in behavior among users. Social concern grew as cases of addiction and erratic conduct were reported in newspapers and observed in communities. Pharmacists remained central to distribution. They advised customers and sold products freely. Some monitored use carefully, while others relied on customer trust. Advertising and medical authority encouraged confidence in safe use, reinforcing ongoing demand. Medical reports increasingly detailed physical and mental symptoms. Doctors recorded restlessness, insomnia, rapid heartbeat, weight loss, mood swings, and agitation. Repeated use produced dependency and withdrawal symptoms. Physicians began documenting these cases systematically. Social and recreational use continued. People experimented in theaters, music halls, and gatherings. Nightlife, work, and home settings all contributed to widespread exposure. Curiosity and observation encouraged more people to try cocaine. Education and early public health messages started to emphasize caution. Some pamphlets, lectures, and school lessons warned about risks of addiction and health problems. Reach was limited, but these initiatives represented early efforts to inform the public. By the late 1890s, cocaine use had reached many levels of society. Adults, children, workers, and performers were all exposed. Products remained available, and social and medical acceptance persisted. Awareness of risks was increasing, but regulation and public understanding were still developing. Medical practices adapted slowly. Cocaine continued to be used in anesthesia, minor procedures, and certain prescriptions. Physicians monitored patients more closely, but public access remained broad. Case studies helped build knowledge about addiction, but gaps in understanding persisted. Social exposure and experimentation were common. Performers, workers, students, and families all had some interaction with cocaine. Public observation contributed to curiosity and gradual spread. Advertising, social acceptance, and medical authority reinforced continued use. Cultural attitudes were complex. Some saw cocaine as fashionable or useful, others viewed it as dangerous. Newspapers, journals, and public discussions reflected these differing perspectives. Awareness of addiction and social consequences was growing steadily. By the turn of the century, cocaine use was still widespread across the United States. In homes, pharmacies, and workplaces, the drug could be found in various forms. Syrups, tonics, powders, and sometimes liquids were sold openly. Families kept small amounts for minor illnesses, while adults sometimes used it for energy, focus, or minor health complaints. Doctors remained key figures in the spread of cocaine. Dentists used it as a local anesthetic for extractions. Surgeons used it for small procedures. Physicians prescribed it for headaches, fatigue, and nervous disorders. Medical journals began reporting cases of addiction more frequently. Some doctors warned patients about the dangers, while others continued to recommend it cautiously for specific conditions. Advertising continued to influence public perception. Newspapers and magazines often ran ads promoting cocaine products as energizing, revitalizing, and safe. Few labels or ads included warnings about long-term risks or addiction. People relied on the authority of pharmacies, doctors, and companies, trusting that these products were safe for everyday use. Cocaine use in workplaces remained common. Laborers in factories, mines, and railroads sometimes took cocaine to stay awake during long hours. Employers occasionally tolerated use because workers appeared more productive. Dependence grew among some laborers, creating patterns of repeated use that became difficult to break. Social exposure contributed to experimentation. Theaters, music halls, and social clubs were places where people could observe cocaine use. Performers sometimes used it to maintain energy during long performances. Patrons who saw others using it might be tempted to try it themselves. These social patterns helped spread cocaine beyond medical and workplace settings. Pharmacies were still the primary point of access for most people. Customers could ask for syrups, tonics, or powders. Some pharmacists monitored purchases and warned about overuse, while others sold products freely. The combination of trust in professionals and advertising reinforced the perception that cocaine was safe. Children continued to be exposed to cocaine. Parents sometimes gave them tonics or powders for colds, teething, or minor illnesses. Some schools and community leaders noticed this practice and began early warnings. Though information about the risks remained limited, medical researchers studied cocaine more systematically. Reports documented symptoms such as insomnia, restlessness, weight loss, rapid heartbeat, mood swings, and irritability. Withdrawal symptoms were noted in cases of repeated use. Physicians began to understand that dependence could develop even with moderate use over time. Cultural perceptions of cocaine remained mixed. In certain urban social circles, it was fashionable or exciting. Families, religious communities, and educators often viewed it as dangerous. Newspapers reflected both sides, publishing reports that highlighted the benefits for some users while warning about the risks and social problems for others. By the early 1900s, communities began discussing regulatory approaches. City councils, state legislatures, and public health committees considered limits on sales, restrictions on advertising, and licensing requirements for pharmacists. Enforcement was inconsistent, but these measures represented the beginning of formal control over cocaine distribution. Social patterns of cocaine use continued to intersect with work, entertainment, and daily life. Laborers used it to manage fatigue. Performers experimented for energy and alertness. Students sometimes tried it for focus. Households stored it for minor complaints. This widespread exposure contributed to ongoing concern among doctors, families, and reformers. Medical debates about cocaine use were ongoing. Some physicians argued for strict restriction to prevent dependence. Others emphasized its usefulness in anesthesia and specific prescriptions. This tension reflected the difficulty of balancing medical utility with emerging evidence of harm. Public education about cocaine developed slowly. Some schools, community organizations, and health leaders provided lectures or pamphlets warning about addiction. Families sometimes learned about dangers through newspapers. Coverage was uneven, and knowledge did not reach all areas of society, leaving many unaware of risks. Pharmacies continued to sell cocaine products, though some implemented limits or offered guidance to customers. Advertising often still claimed health benefits, encouraging curiosity and repeated use. Medical authority and consumer trust reinforced ongoing demand. Cases of addiction became increasingly visible. Families reported behavioral changes, irritability, and restlessness in adults and children who had become dependent. Physicians documented withdrawal symptoms and advised caution. Communities began paying closer attention to the social consequences of widespread cocaine use. Urban law enforcement noticed effects of cocaine in neighborhoods. Reports included minor crimes, disorderly conduct, and erratic behavior. Severe legal action was rare, but public concern over safety and social stability contributed to the push for regulation. Workers in urban and industrial areas often relied on cocaine to maintain energy. Repeated use sometimes led to dependence. Supervisors occasionally observed patterns of behavior indicating overuse or withdrawal, which highlighted the growing social impact of cocaine on labor populations. Medical publications increasingly reported detailed case studies. Physicians documented physical and mental symptoms, including rapid heartbeat, insomnia, weight loss, irritability, agitation, and mood swings. Withdrawal effects and signs of dependence were described. These reports helped build early knowledge of addiction in the United States. Social and recreational use continued. Performers, laborers, students, and families all had some exposure. Observing others using cocaine contributed to experimentation and spread. Nightlife, workplaces, and home environments all played roles in exposure and normalization. Education and public health warnings started to appear more frequently. Lectures, pamphlets, and school lessons described potential addiction, health risks, and symptoms. Reach was uneven, but these early efforts contributed to gradually increasing public awareness. Cultural attitudes remained divided. Some social groups embraced cocaine for energy or recreation. Others viewed it as dangerous, inappropriate, or unhealthy. Newspapers, medical journals, and public discussions reflected these differing opinions, often emphasizing either health benefits or risks depending on the audience. By the early 1900s, cocaine use had reached a wide range of social groups. Adults, children, workers, students, and performers all had some exposure. Pharmacies and medical professionals continued to supply products containing cocaine. Advertising and social acceptance helped maintain demand. Awareness of addiction and health risks was increasing but uneven. Medical practice evolved slowly. Cocaine remained a standard anesthetic for dental and minor surgical procedures. Some physicians prescribed it for fatigue, nervous disorders, or headaches, while monitoring patients for signs of dependence. Case studies and observations helped build early medical understanding of addiction. Workplaces reflected patterns of cocaine use among laborers. Long hours, heavy physical work, and limited rest encouraged experimentation. Employers occasionally tolerated or encouraged use to maintain productivity. Dependence among workers created patterns of repeated use that were difficult to break. Pharmacies remained central in distribution. Some pharmacists advised caution, monitored sales, or limited doses. Others sold products freely. Trust in professional authority, combined with advertising and social norms, reinforced continued experimentation and use. Children continued to be affected. Parents gave tonics or powders for minor illnesses. Schools and community leaders began raising awareness, but knowledge about the risks remained limited. Exposure in early life contributed to a broader pattern of social use. Medical research focused on understanding cocaine's effects on both body and mind. Symptoms included insomnia, restlessness, rapid heartbeat, weight loss, irritability, agitation, and mood swings. Repeated use could lead to dependence and withdrawal symptoms. Physicians documented these effects carefully. Social exposure remained widespread. Nightlife, workplaces, and family settings all contributed. People observed others using cocaine, which encouraged curiosity and experimentation. Performers, laborers, students, and families all participated to some extent. Advertising continued to emphasize benefits. Companies promoted tonics, syrups, and powders with claims of energy, vitality, and well-being. Few warnings about dependence or long-term health risks appeared. Public trust in brands, pharmacists, and medical professionals helped sustain demand and experimentation. By the end of the first decade of the 1900s, cocaine use was a widespread social and medical phenomenon. Adults, children, workers, performers, and families had all been exposed. Awareness of health risks and addiction was growing. Regulation had begun in some areas, but access remained broad. In the 1890s, some of the earliest systematic observations of cocaine addiction began to take shape. Physicians started to notice that patients who had been prescribed the drug for minor complaints were sometimes returning with new issues. These issues included insomnia, irritability, and a constant need for more of the substance. Doctors began documenting patterns of use, realizing that even moderate doses could lead to dependency over time. Pharmaceutical companies were still producing new products containing cocaine. Some introduced powders meant to dissolve in water or beverages. Others created syrups marketed for fatigue, nervous disorders, or general weakness. These products were often placed on prominent shelves in drugstores, and many advertisements described them as safe for regular consumption. Medical students and researchers began conducting early studies on the physiological effects of cocaine. They observed that the drug could increase heart rate, raise blood pressure, and affect breathing in some users. Mental effects, including anxiety, restlessness, and agitation, were also noted. These observations contributed to a slowly growing body of knowledge about the risks associated with repeated use. In urban neighborhoods, families observed changes in community behavior. Some residents who used cocaine heavily became more withdrawn, irritable, or unpredictable. Community leaders and local organizations began holding meetings to discuss how to handle these changes. At the same time, social reformers were beginning to link cocaine use to broader concerns about public health and safety. Street vendors occasionally sold small doses of cocaine mixed into drinks or powders. In cities, this informal distribution created a challenge for authorities. Law enforcement and local governments struggled to track sales and prevent misuse. The combination of medical availability, commercial advertising, and street-level distribution meant that cocaine was accessible to a wide range of people. Some reformers began urging limits on the use of cocaine in public spaces. There were discussions about restricting sales in pharmacies, limiting advertising, and warning families about the risks. Although formal regulations were limited, these early campaigns reflected growing public concern and recognition of the problem. Cocaine use among workers continued to be common. Long hours in factories, mines, and other physically demanding jobs encouraged repeated use. Supervisors sometimes noticed that workers relied on the substance to maintain energy and productivity. Over time, this led to a pattern of dependence among certain labor populations. In medical practice, physicians began experimenting with safer alternatives for fatigue and minor ailments. Some recommended other tonics or stimulants in place of cocaine, though these substitutes were not always effective. This gradual shift in medical advice reflected a growing understanding of the dangers associated with the drug. Urban hospitals started encountering more cases of cocaine-related health problems. Patients arrived with insomnia, agitation, or unusual behavioral symptoms. Doctors began documenting these cases more systematically, which helped build early medical knowledge about addiction and its consequences. At the same time, advertisements for cocaine products were still widespread. Many emphasized energy, vitality, and alertness, often ignoring or minimizing potential health risks. Consumers relied on these claims and trusted the guidance of pharmacists and doctors, which helped sustain the popularity of these products despite emerging reports of harm. Children's exposure continued to be a concern. Families sometimes gave cocaine, containing syrups for colds, teething discomfort, or minor illnesses. School officials and community leaders began observing the effects on children and attempting to educate parents. though consistent public guidance was limited. Some medical journals began publishing letters and reports from doctors describing long-term cases of addiction. They detailed symptoms such as chronic restlessness, irritability, insomnia, loss of appetite, and mood swings. These case studies helped establish a growing awareness that repeated use could cause serious and lasting health effects. Social attitudes toward cocaine varied across communities. In certain urban circles, it remained fashionable or a symbol of energy and sophistication. In contrast, rural communities, religious groups, and educators often considered it dangerous and inappropriate. These differing attitudes contributed to a complex social environment surrounding cocaine use. Cocaine began to intersect with other emerging substances. Some users combined it with alcohol or opiates, which sometimes intensified effects and increased risks. Medical observers documented that these combinations could worsen insomnia, agitation, and mental instability. They noted that users combining substances required careful observation to prevent harm. Law enforcement in cities began to see patterns of minor crime and disorder linked to cocaine use. Reports included theft, fights, or other unpredictable behavior among individuals under the influence. Serious legal consequences were still rare, but public concern about safety and social order contributed to debates about the need for regulation. Some community groups began informal monitoring of cocaine use. Local leaders encouraged families to observe symptoms in household members and to limit access to children. Religious and charitable organizations sometimes provided education about addiction, emphasizing the potential dangers without using formalized rules or regulations. Pharmacists had varying approaches to cocaine sales. Some limited quantities advised caution and educated buyers. Others continued to sell products freely, relying on trust, social norms, and the reputation of their stores. This created inconsistency in access and exposure, with some areas seeing stricter oversight than others. Medical research continued to expand. Physicians observed repeated behavioral patterns in patients, noting increased need for the drug, irritability, and mental instability. These observations were compiled into early reports and presented in medical journals, slowly contributing to a broader understanding of cocaine's effects on the mind and body. Cocaine use in workplaces was increasingly visible. Laborers in factories, construction sites, and railroads used it to cope with long shifts and physical exhaustion. Some became dependent over time, requiring the drug to maintain normal function. During work hours, employers noticed these patterns but often tolerated them because productivity appeared to improve. Medical practices slowly adapted. Doctors started experimenting with alternative treatments for fatigue or minor illnesses, using non-addictive tonics and therapies. While cocaine remained available for anesthesia and some prescriptions, physicians began emphasizing caution when recommending it for repeated use. Community awareness grew slowly. Newspapers and public lectures began reporting cases of addiction and social problems caused by cocaine. Stories described families affected by dependence and communities noticing behavioral changes among users. Public awareness of potential harm increased gradually, though access to the drug remained widespread. Pharmaceutical companies continued marketing products widely. Tonics, powders, and syrups remained available in stores and pharmacies. Advertising often ignored health risks, focusing instead on benefits like energy, vitality, and relief from minor complaints. This marketing strategy helped maintain consumer confidence and demand. Children were increasingly part of the discussion. School officials and medical professionals observed the impact of early exposure. Parents were encouraged to limit access, though consistent education and guidance were limited. These early efforts marked the beginning of concern for youth in relation to cocaine use. Medical journals documented long-term effects of repeated use. Case studies included restlessness, insomnia, irritability, mood swings, weight loss, and increased heart rate. Withdrawal symptoms were also described. These studies helped build knowledge about addiction and informed early discussions about regulation and public health. Social patterns of use continued. Cocaine was present in households, workplaces, and entertainment venues. Performers, laborers, students, and families all had some exposure. Observation of others using the drug contributed to curiosity and experimentation. Nightlife, work, and domestic environments reinforced the prevalence of cocaine in daily life. Public education about cocaine risks developed gradually. Lectures, pamphlets, and newspaper articles emphasized potential health effects and symptoms of addiction. Families, schools, and community organizations participated when possible. While coverage was uneven, these efforts helped increase awareness and inform public discussions about the substance. By the late 1890s and early 1900s, cocaine use had reached a wide spectrum of society. Adults, children, workers, students, and performers were all affected. Pharmacies and medical professionals continued to provide products. Advertising, social observation, and curiosity encouraged continued use, while early regulation and public education slowly emerged to address growing concerns. By the early 1900s, more cities and towns began noticing patterns of cocaine dependence in their populations. Local physicians reported cases in which patients initially used cocaine for medical reasons, but gradually became reliant on it. This pattern was observed across social classes. Wealthy families, working-class households, and poorer communities all saw members developing a need for the drug over time. Pharmacies remained a central point of access. Some pharmacists recognized the emerging problem of addiction and started limiting sales or offering advice about safe use. Others continued to sell freely, trusting the customer to use the product responsibly. These differences created a situation in which access to cocaine varied depending on the store or region. Doctors observed more complex cases of addiction. Some patients developed symptoms that included chronic insomnia, severe irritability, rapid heartbeat, and weight loss. Others reported mental changes, such as anxiety, mood swings, and occasional paranoia. Physicians began noting that repeated use could produce both physical and mental dependence. Public concern grew alongside medical observation. Newspapers ran stories describing the social effects of cocaine use. Some articles focused on unusual cases of addiction, while others reported on behavior in workplaces or neighborhoods. These reports contributed to a growing public understanding that cocaine was not harmless, even though it was still widely available. In workplaces, dependence became more noticeable. Factory workers, railroad laborers, and miners sometimes relied on cocaine to maintain energy during long, physically demanding shifts. Supervisors occasionally observed workers experiencing irritability, restlessness, or agitation. While productivity sometimes improved in the short term, repeated use led to long-term health and social consequences. Medical studies began documenting withdrawal symptoms in users who stopped taking cocaine. These symptoms included restlessness, agitation, insomnia, and in some cases, severe cravings. Early research suggested that even moderate doses, if taken repeatedly, could lead to a cycle of dependence that was difficult to break. Advertising for cocaine products remained pervasive. Companies promoted tonics, powders, and syrups with claims that they could increase energy, reduce fatigue, and improve general health. Few labels included any warnings about potential addiction or long-term health effects. The widespread advertising reinforced social acceptance of the drug and encouraged new users. Children continued to be affected. Parents sometimes administered cocaine containing tonics for colds, minor pains, or teething discomfort. Teachers and school officials observed the effects in students, noting irritability or difficulty concentrating. Early efforts to educate parents about risks were limited but gradually increased. Medical professionals began forming a clearer understanding of the health consequences of cocaine use. Chronic use was linked to heart problems, persistent insomnia, mental instability, and mood disorders. Physicians also recognized that repeated exposure during childhood could have lasting effects on development and behavior. In urban neighborhoods, social observation played a key role in the spread of cocaine use. People noticed friends, neighbors, and co-workers using the substance. Curiosity and social influence encouraged experimentation. Public spaces, workplaces, and family gatherings all contributed to exposure. Law enforcement in cities occasionally encountered problems associated with cocaine use. Some users engaged in minor crimes, such as theft or disorderly conduct, possibly related to dependence. Serious legal consequences remained rare, but public discussions increasingly focused on safety, social stability, and the need for regulation. Cultural attitudes remained varied. Among certain urban social groups, cocaine was seen as fashionable, exciting, or useful for energy. In contrast, rural communities, religious groups, and educators often viewed it as dangerous or inappropriate. This mixed perception shaped public discussions, newspaper reports, and debates about regulation. Medical publications increasingly included letters, case reports, and research studies detailing symptoms of cocaine dependence. Physicians described chronic insomnia, irritability, restlessness, weight loss, rapid heartbeat, mood swings, and mental changes. Reports of withdrawal symptoms added to the growing understanding of the drug's addictive potential. Recreational and social use continued to expand. Performers, students, laborers, and households all experimented with cocaine. Public observation of others using the drug encouraged curiosity and gradual adoption. Nightlife, work, and domestic environments reinforced its presence in daily life. Public health education began to grow, though unevenly. Pamphlets, lectures, and newspaper articles highlighted potential addiction, symptoms, and health consequences. Families, schools, and community organizations participated in spreading awareness. Despite these efforts, access remained broad and use continued. Pharmacies remained a critical point for distributing cocaine. Some implemented limits, offered guidance, or educated customers about risks. Others continued selling freely, relying on social norms and trust. This created uneven exposure and varied patterns of use in different areas. Workplaces reflected growing dependence among laborers. Factory, railroad, and mine workers sometimes relied on cocaine to maintain energy and alertness. Supervisors observed behavioral changes in some workers, including irritability, restlessness, and a need for repeated doses. These patterns highlighted the social consequences of long-term use. Medical practice began evolving gradually. While cocaine remained widely used for anesthesia in dentistry and minor surgeries, physicians started experimenting with alternative treatments for fatigue or minor illnesses. Early tonics and therapies that did not contain cocaine were promoted in some medical communities, though adoption was slow. Community awareness grew slowly. Newspapers and public lectures increasingly discussed cases of addiction and social effects. Families observed behavioral changes in adults and children. Early education and warnings started to influence public perception. Though access to reliable information was limited, pharmaceutical companies continued producing and marketing cocaine products. Tonics, powders, and syrups were widely available in stores and pharmacies. Advertising highlighted energy, vitality, and relief from minor ailments. Minimal attention was given to long-term health risks or addiction, keeping demand strong. Children remained a focus of concern. Parents sometimes administered cocaine for minor complaints, while educators and community leaders worked to raise awareness of the dangers. Limited public education and inconsistent guidance meant that many children continued to be exposed. Medical journals compiled long-term observations. Doctors described repeated use causing insomnia, irritability, agitation, mood swings, weight loss, rapid heartbeat, and withdrawal symptoms. These case studies contributed to a growing understanding of cocaine's addictive potential and helped inform early medical advice. Social patterns of cocaine use were diverse. Households, workplaces, schools, and recreational spaces all contributed to exposure. People observed others using the drug, which encouraged experimentation. Performers, students, laborers, and families all played a role in sustaining public awareness and use of cocaine. Public health efforts developed gradually. Lectures, pamphlets, and newspaper articles attempted to educate families about addiction and health risks. Schools and community organizations participated when possible. Despite these efforts, cocaine remained widely accessible, and use continued across social classes. Cultural attitudes remained complex. Urban social groups often saw cocaine as fashionable or useful for energy, while rural areas, religious communities, and educators viewed it as dangerous. This division shaped public discussion, regulation efforts, and social responses to the drug. By the early 1900s, cocaine use had reached many areas of American society. Adults, children, laborers, students, and performers had all been exposed. Pharmacies and medical professionals provided products containing cocaine. Advertising and social observation reinforced demand, while early regulation and education attempted to address emerging concerns. Medical research continued to document patterns of dependence, withdrawal, and physical and mental health effects. Physicians observed insomnia, restlessness, irritability, mood changes, weight loss, and rapid heartbeat. These observations helped form the basis for later efforts to regulate cocaine and educate the public. Workplaces continued to reflect cocaine use among laborers. Long hours, physical demands, and fatigue encouraged experimentation. Dependence sometimes developed, with workers requiring repeated doses to maintain normal function. Employers observed these patterns and occasionally tolerated them due to perceived productivity benefits. Children and households continued to experience exposure. Parents gave small doses for minor ailments, while schools and communities began providing early warnings. Public education remained limited and inconsistent, leaving some children and families unaware of risks. Pharmacies and medical practices were central in the continued distribution of cocaine. Some limited sales and advised caution, while others relied on consumer trust. Advertising promoted energy and health benefits, reinforcing use and curiosity. Medical authority and social norms contributed to widespread experimentation. By this time, cocaine use had become a common and visible part of life in many American cities. Social exposure, family use, medical prescriptions, workplace use, and advertising all contributed to widespread familiarity with the drug. Communities, doctors, and reformers were beginning to recognize the challenges it posed. In the mid-1890s, several medical colleges and research institutions began to examine cocaine more closely. Students and physicians conducted experiments to observe the effects of the drug under controlled conditions. They measured heart rate, blood pressure, and mental responses after different doses. These studies were small and often informal, but they helped establish early scientific observations of both short-term stimulation and potential health risks. Cocaine started to appear in professional medical supplies beyond tonics and powders. Some surgeons used it to manage eye surgery procedures. Dentists applied it to control pain during extraction of teeth and other minor procedures. Hospitals began keeping small stocks of cocaine for specific medical tasks. Its presence in professional settings reinforced the perception of legitimacy. Even as addiction cases became more frequent, some urban hospitals began setting up informal observation units to to monitor patients who displayed signs of cocaine dependence. Physicians kept records on patients who had developed insomnia, restlessness, and mood disturbances after repeated doses. These records helped doctors start identifying patterns of behavior that might indicate addiction. Cocaine use was reported in early social reform documents. Reformers noticed the substance was present in bars, street-level commerce, and even some social clubs. They documented cases in which young men and women used cocaine to stay alert at night events or to cope with long hours at work. These observations helped build early awareness that cocaine was not limited to medical use. In cities with growing populations, the combination of alcohol and cocaine began to be noted. Some individuals mixed the substances to enhance feelings of energy or reduce fatigue. Physicians observed that mixing cocaine with alcohol increased heart rate and could create mental instability. Reports of aggressive or erratic behavior occasionally appeared in local newspapers. Some social organizations began developing informal guidance for families. They encouraged parents to monitor their children's access to medicines and tonics. Religious groups emphasized moral and health warnings about using cocaine for non-medical purposes. Charitable organizations sometimes offered lectures describing symptoms of addiction and behavioral changes associated with repeated use. Advertising for cocaine products evolved. In addition to tonics and powders, new items appeared, including candy and lozenges containing small amounts of cocaine. These products were marketed as harmless energy boosters or minor remedies for fatigue. Many stores placed them near the checkout counters, making them easily accessible to children and adults alike. In rural areas, cocaine exposure increased more slowly, but it did reach some farming communities. Families sometimes ordered cocaine containing products through mail order catalogs or purchased them from traveling salesmen. Farmers used these products for energy during long days in the field or gave them to animals for minor ailments, reflecting the broad trust in these substances at the time. Medical journals of the period published articles highlighting unusual cases. One study described a patient who began using cocaine to treat persistent headaches, but developed severe agitation and insomnia after several weeks. Another report detailed a young adult who took small doses daily for fatigue and later exhibited irritability, restlessness, and inability to sleep for multiple nights. These case studies emphasized the early recognition of addiction potential. Urban newspapers started reporting on social issues related to cocaine. Articles described incidents in theaters, saloons, and social clubs. Patrons sometimes displayed erratic behavior after using cocaine, including arguments or minor accidents. Local authorities used these reports to justify discussions about regulation, even though cocaine was still widely legal and available. Some pharmacies began experimenting with labeling changes. A few stores added small warnings advising users to take moderate doses or to avoid giving products to children. This practice was inconsistent, but it represented an early attempt at consumer guidance. Many customers continued to trust the brands and relied on pharmacists' authority rather than questioning the safety of the product. Doctors and medical students began collaborating on small-scale studies. Some tracked patients over weeks to observe the effects of repeated doses. They recorded physical responses like elevated pulse, restlessness, and weight changes, as well as mental symptoms such as mood swings and difficulty concentrating. These studies provided early systematic evidence of both short-term and long-term effects. Laborers' use of cocaine became more organized in certain industries. Railroad workers, miners, and factory employees sometimes shared powders or syrups to maintain alertness during shifts. Reports indicated that some workers could no longer perform effectively without repeated doses. Employers occasionally noticed this, but often tolerated it because productivity seemed to improve. Cocaine began to appear in specialty health products. Toothpaste and lozenges containing small amounts were marketed for oral health or to reduce fatigue. Consumers were often unaware of the concentration or the potential for dependence. These products further normalized cocaine use in daily life. Community reform meetings often included discussions about public health risks. Some leaders argued for regulating sales, restricting access for children, and providing educational lectures about the substance. Religious organizations sometimes focused on moral guidance, framing cocaine use as a risk to personal and family well-being. Medical records from hospitals documented withdrawal patterns. Patients who stopped taking cocaine often became restless, anxious, or unable to sleep. Physicians observed that even moderate users could experience difficulty when trying to discontinue. These observations helped reinforce early understanding of addiction. Cultural exposure to cocaine continued in professional settings. Performers and musicians often used the drug to maintain energy during long rehearsals or shows. Observers at social gatherings or theaters sometimes experimented after seeing others use it. The visibility of use contributed to gradual spread among certain social groups. Some early legislation proposals emerged during the late 1890s. City councils and state governments debated limits on sales, licensing requirements for pharmacies, and restrictions on advertising. These proposals reflected increasing recognition of the social and health risks, though enforcement and implementation varied widely. Cocaine use among children drew growing attention. Parents gave syrups or tonics for minor ailments, unaware of potential dependence. Schools began informal monitoring, noticing irritability, restlessness, or fatigue in students exposed to the drug. Early efforts to educate families were emerging, though access remained widespread. Medical practitioners started experimenting with alternatives. Some substituted non-addictive stimulants for patients seeking energy or relief from fatigue. These alternatives included herbal tonics or different chemical compounds believed to be safer than cocaine. Adoption of alternatives was gradual, and cocaine remained widely available for both medical and non-medical purposes. Pharmacies continued to be a primary source of cocaine. Some implemented informal limits on sales, warning users about repeated use. Others sold freely, trusting customer judgment. Advertising campaigns emphasized vitality, energy, and alertness, helping maintain demand even as awareness of health risks grew. Urban communities observed social patterns of cocaine use. People noticed neighbors, coworkers, and friends using the drug for energy, social activity, or minor health complaints. Observing others encouraged experimentation, particularly in workplaces, theaters, and social clubs. This contributed to steady growth in social exposure. Medical journals published increasingly detailed reports. Physicians documented physical symptoms such as elevated heart rate, insomnia, weight loss, and restlessness. Mental effects, including anxiety, irritability, and mood swings, were also recorded. Case studies of withdrawal reinforced early understanding of dependence and addiction. In the early 1900s, informal networks emerged among consumers of cocaine. Workers sometimes shared doses to maintain alertness during long hours. Performers exchanged powders or syrups to manage fatigue during rehearsals. Families occasionally shared tonics at home for minor illnesses. These informal practices contributed to the spread of use and normalized consumption across social groups. Pharmaceutical innovations continued. Companies introduced new forms of cocaine products, including lozenges, candies, and small powders designed for personal use. These products were marketed as safe, energizing, and beneficial for health, often ignoring potential dependence or long-term effects. Consumers trusted these claims, reinforcing the widespread presence of cocaine in daily life. hospitals continued to document the medical effects of repeated cocaine use. Patients experienced insomnia, irritability, restlessness, weight loss, and increased heart rate. Mental symptoms included anxiety, mood swings, and occasional paranoia. Withdrawal symptoms were observed in patients attempting to discontinue use, contributing to early knowledge of addiction. Social reformers and community leaders increasingly emphasized education. Pamphlets, lectures, and school programs warned about addiction, behavioral changes, and health risks. Although coverage was uneven, these efforts marked a gradual shift toward public awareness and concern about cocaine use. By the late 1890s, more organized efforts to track cocaine use began to emerge in several cities. Health officials, physicians, and reformers started collecting reports from pharmacies, hospitals, and families. They documented cases of dependence, unusual behavior, and physical symptoms. These early records helped establish a clearer understanding of how widespread use had become. In pharmacies, sales patterns began to change slightly. Some pharmacists noticed that certain customers returned frequently, purchasing increasingly larger amounts. They began questioning repeated purchases and occasionally warned individuals about possible overuse. Other pharmacists continued to sell products freely, trusting customer judgment. These differences in practice created uneven exposure in different neighborhoods. Medical schools began incorporating lessons about cocaine's effects into their training. Students were taught to observe physical responses, such as rapid heartbeat, insomnia, and restlessness, as well as behavioral changes like irritability, anxiety, and mood swings. These observations helped young doctors recognize signs of dependence when they encountered patients in clinics and hospitals. Urban hospitals reported a variety of symptoms among patients who had been using cocaine repeatedly. Some arrived with severe insomnia or mental agitation, unable to sleep for multiple nights. Others experienced tremors, loss of appetite, and unusual irritability. Physicians began to document these cases systematically, building a foundation for early addiction studies. Social reformers began to notice patterns in the use of cocaine among young adults. Reports indicated that students, apprentices, and laborers were experimenting with small doses to improve energy and concentration. Some reformers organized public lectures to explain the potential dangers and encourage caution. These events were often attended by parents, teachers, and community members who were concerned about the growing use of the substance among youth. Cocaine appeared in an increasing number of commercial products. Beyond tonics and powders, candy, lozenges, and flavored syrups were marketed for minor ailments and energy boosts. These products were widely available in pharmacies, general stores, and sometimes through mail order catalogs. Children and adults alike could access these items, often without understanding the potential for dependence. In workplace settings, cocaine use was noticeable among laborers performing physically demanding tasks. Railroad workers, miners, and factory employees sometimes relied on the substance to stay alert during long shifts. Supervisors observed that some workers experienced irritability, restlessness, and fatigue if doses were missed. These patterns demonstrated early recognition of dependence in occupational settings. Medical journals increasingly published case studies of addiction. One report described a patient who began using cocaine for persistent headaches and developed severe irritability and insomnia over several weeks. Another detailed a laborer who relied on small doses to complete long workdays and gradually required more to achieve the same effects. These studies highlighted both physical and psychological consequences of repeated use. Children's exposure to cocaine drew attention from schools and community leaders. Some parents continued giving syrups or tonics for minor ailments. Teachers reported children exhibiting restlessness, difficulty concentrating, and unusual irritability. Early public education efforts attempted to advise families about safe practices, though consistent guidance was limited. Cultural attitudes toward cocaine remained mixed. Urban populations often viewed the substance as fashionable or useful for energy, while rural communities, religious groups, and educators emphasized its risks. Newspapers frequently reported both stories of perceived benefits and warnings about addiction, reflecting divided public opinion. Law enforcement began observing cocaine-related incidents in urban neighborhoods. Minor thefts, fights, and disorderly conduct were sometimes linked to use. Authorities started to track reports and collaborate with medical professionals to understand patterns of behavior. While serious legal consequences were rare, the association between cocaine and social disruption contributed to early discussions of regulation. Medical observations also began to focus on the combination of cocaine with other substances. Physicians noted that some users mixed it with alcohol or opiates to intensify effects or reduce fatigue. These combinations were associated with more pronounced agitation, irregular heartbeat, and mental instability. Documentation of these cases helped inform early warnings about multiple substance use. Community organizations became involved in awareness efforts. Religious groups, charitable institutions, and early public health committees provided lectures and pamphlets about the dangers of cocaine. They focused on warning parents and young people about dependency, behavioral changes, and potential health problems. These initiatives reflected a growing recognition of cocaine as a social as well as medical issue. Pharmacies adapted in varying ways. Some limited sales to small quantities and monitored repeat purchases. Others continued selling freely, relying on reputation and customer trust. Advertising often emphasized vitality, alertness, and relief from minor complaints while downplaying risks. Consumers largely relied on these messages, which helped sustain widespread use. Hospitals documented early withdrawal symptoms. Patients who discontinued use often experienced restlessness, agitation, insomnia, and discomfort. Physicians observed that even moderate users could struggle when stopping. These observations contributed to the growing understanding of dependence and informed early discussions about the medical management of cocaine use. Social use continued to expand in entertainment venues. Musicians, performers, and theater workers sometimes used cocaine to maintain energy during long rehearsals or shows. Audiences and coworkers observed this use, which contributed to curiosity and experimentation among spectators. Nightlife, social gatherings, and workplace exposure reinforced familiarity with the drug. Advertising strategies became increasingly diverse. Beyond tonics and powders, companies sold candies, lozenges, and syrups for children and adults. Labels emphasized energy, health, and relief from fatigue, often ignoring long-term risks. These strategies contributed to normalization, making cocaine seem like an ordinary household item. Medical research continued to explore physiological and psychological effects. Physicians documented insomnia, irritability, restlessness, weight loss, rapid heartbeat, and mood swings in repeated users. Mental effects such as anxiety, agitation, and difficulty concentrating were noted. Case studies of withdrawal reinforced understanding of dependency. Laborers' use of cocaine remained significant in urban industrial environments. Workers in railroads, mines, and factories sometimes relied on it to maintain performance. Supervisors observed that some laborers could not function effectively without repeated doses. These observations highlighted the social and occupational consequences of addiction. Schools and community organizations became more proactive. Educators observed the impact of cocaine on students' behavior and attention. Pamphlets, lectures, and informal guidance advised families about potential risks. While coverage was incomplete, these efforts represented early steps toward preventive education. Pharmacies remained central to distribution. Some stores offered guidance, limited quantities, and informal warnings. Others continued standard sales practices. Advertising reinforced trust in the products and in medical authority, contributing to widespread experimentation and regular use. Medical journals increasingly highlighted patterns of long-term use. Physicians reported chronic insomnia, irritability, restlessness, mood swings, weight loss, and increased heart rate. Mental health concerns, including anxiety and agitation, were emphasized. Early case studies informed growing awareness of addiction potential and helped establish protocols for observation. Social exposure remained important. People observed neighbors, co-workers, friends, and family using cocaine for energy, fatigue, or social purposes. These patterns encouraged experimentation, particularly in social clubs, theaters, and workplaces. Familiarity with the drug helped normalize use across age groups and occupations. Public health initiatives gradually expanded. Lectures, pamphlets, and newspaper articles warned about physical, mental, and social risks. Schools and community organizations attempted to educate parents and young people. Despite these efforts, widespread availability and limited enforcement meant that cocaine remained easily accessible. Medical practitioners experimented with alternatives to cocaine. Herbal remedies, other stimulants, and different tonics were introduced for fatigue, nervous disorders, and minor complaints. While these alternatives were sometimes effective, cocaine continued to dominate the market because of its availability, perceived strength, and medical legitimacy. By the early 1900s, cocaine had established a significant presence in both medical and social contexts. Adults, children, workers, and performers were all exposed. Pharmacies and medical professionals continued to supply products, while advertising, social observation, and curiosity reinforced ongoing use. Early regulation and public health education began to address these issues, though full control and understanding would take more time to develop. In the early 1900s, public concern about cocaine use grew steadily. Families, medical professionals, and community leaders began to notice patterns in both physical and mental health among users. Some adults who had taken the drug for medical purposes developed persistent dependence. They experienced insomnia, irritability, mood swings, and rapid heartbeat. These cases were increasingly reported in medical journals, contributing to a clearer understanding of the risks associated with repeated use. Children remained particularly vulnerable. Parents sometimes administered cocaine containing tonics or syrups for colds, teething pain, or minor ailments. Teachers and school administrators observed that children who had been exposed sometimes had difficulty concentrating, were restless, or displayed unusual irritability. Early education campaigns aimed to warn parents, but reach was limited, and many families remained unaware of the dangers. Urban laborers continued to rely on cocaine in physically demanding jobs. Railroad workers, miners, and factory laborers sometimes used small doses to stay alert through long, exhausting shifts. Reports indicated that dependence could develop quickly in these environments. Supervisors occasionally noticed that workers became irritable or restless if they missed doses, but tolerance or outright discouragement from employers was rare because productivity appeared to improve temporarily. Medical research expanded during this period. Physicians documented physical and psychological symptoms in a variety of patients. Repeated use of cocaine was associated with elevated heart rate, high blood pressure, tremors, and weight loss. Mental symptoms included anxiety, irritability, mood swings, agitation, and sometimes paranoia. Withdrawal symptoms were also observed in those who attempted to stop, demonstrating early evidence of dependence. Pharmacies remained a central point for distributing cocaine. Some stores began experimenting with limits on quantity or small warnings about repeated use. Others continued selling freely, relying on consumer trust and social norms. Advertising reinforced the perception of cocaine as safe and beneficial, often emphasizing energy, vitality, and relief from minor complaints, while ignoring risks of addiction. Social and recreational use became more widespread. Musicians, performers, and actors often used cocaine to maintain energy during long performances or late rehearsals. Patrons and audiences sometimes observed this use, which encouraged experimentation among spectators. Social gatherings, theaters, and clubs became spaces where cocaine use was both visible and socially reinforced. In rural areas, exposure increased gradually. Farmers occasionally received cocaine products through mail, order catalogs, or traveling salesmen. Some families used it for energy or to treat minor ailments in both people and animals. Although access in rural areas was slower than in cities, widespread trust in pharmacies and medical authority allowed the substance to reach these communities steadily. Medical journals began compiling more detailed observations. Case studies described repeated use leading to insomnia, irritability, weight loss, and mental changes. Withdrawal symptoms were highlighted, showing that even moderate users could develop dependence. These records helped physicians recognize patterns of addiction and informed early medical guidance. Law enforcement started to take notice in urban centers. Minor offenses, including theft and disorderly conduct, were occasionally linked to cocaine use. Serious criminal cases were rare, but reports helped justify discussions about limiting access and controlling distribution. Some city officials began debating licensing requirements for pharmacists or restrictions on sales and advertising. Pharmaceutical innovations continued to expand the availability of cocaine. Candy, lozenges, syrups, and powders were marketed as harmless remedies for fatigue or minor complaints. These products were often displayed prominently in stores, easily accessible to both children and adults. Marketing strategies emphasized health and energy benefits, reinforcing social acceptance and normalizing regular use. Community organizations increased involvement in public education. Religious groups, charitable societies, and early health committees provided lectures, pamphlets, and discussions about the risks of cocaine. Emphasis was placed on warning families about dependency, behavioral changes, and potential health problems. These initiatives contributed to slowly growing public awareness. Although access remained broad, medical schools began integrating observations about cocaine into their training. Students learned to recognize physical signs, including elevated heart rate, tremors, and insomnia, as well as behavioral changes such as irritability, anxiety, and mood swings. Early clinical experience helped young doctors understand the potential for dependence and reinforced careful prescribing practices. Children's exposure continued to concern educators and physicians. Some families continued to give cocaine containing products for minor ailments. Teachers reported that children exposed sometimes struggled with attention, restlessness, or irritability. Early public health efforts encouraged families to monitor access, though consistent education was still limited. Cultural attitudes remained divided. Urban social groups often viewed cocaine as a fashionable or effective stimulant. Rural communities, religious organizations, and educators emphasized the health risks and potential for addiction. Newspapers reflected these differing opinions, publishing both promotional content and cautionary stories, contributing to mixed public perceptions. Medical practitioners started exploring alternatives to cocaine for fatigue, headaches, and minor complaints. Herbal remedies, other stimulants, and early tonics were promoted in some communities. Adoption was slow, as cocaine remained readily available, perceived as effective, and widely trusted due to its association with medical practice. Hospitals documented increasingly complex cases of addiction. Patients who used cocaine repeatedly experienced restlessness, irritability, insomnia, weight loss, elevated heart rate, and occasional paranoia. Physicians observed withdrawal symptoms, including agitation and intense cravings. These records were shared in medical journals, establishing a foundation for early understanding of addiction and dependence. Social exposure remained a significant factor. Families, workplaces, schools, and entertainment venues all contributed to experimentation. People observed neighbors, coworkers, and performers using cocaine for energy or minor ailments. This visibility encouraged curiosity, leading to gradual adoption in social and professional contexts. Workplace dependence became a topic of discussion among reformers. Employers and supervisors noticed that some laborers could not maintain productivity without repeated doses. Although some tolerated the behavior because it appeared beneficial, discussions began about the health and social consequences of long-term dependence in industrial and labor-intensive environments. Pharmacies continued to adapt in varied ways. Some implemented informal limits, monitored repeated purchases, and advised customers about potential overuse. Others continued standard sales practices. Advertising emphasized vitality, energy, and relief from minor ailments, creating consumer confidence and normalizing everyday use. Medical journals increasingly included detailed case studies. Physicians documented physical symptoms, mental changes, and withdrawal effects. Reports highlighted patterns of dependence in patients who had initially taken cocaine for medical reasons or minor complaints. These observations contributed to the growing awareness of cocaine as both a medical and social concern. Public health initiatives slowly expanded. Lectures, pamphlets, and newspaper articles aimed to educate families about addiction and behavioral changes. Schools and community organizations participated when possible. Despite these efforts, cocaine remained widely accessible, and social, medical, and commercial exposure continued to reinforce its presence. By the early 1900s, cocaine use had become deeply embedded in American society. Adults, children, laborers, students, and performers were all exposed. Pharmacies and medical professionals continued to supply products containing cocaine. Advertising, social observation, and curiosity sustained demand. Early regulation and public health campaigns began addressing emerging concerns, setting the stage for more formalized laws in the years ahead. By the early 1900s, concern about cocaine use had grown enough that some state and city governments began considering legal restrictions. Reports from physicians, hospitals, and reformers showed that repeated use could cause dependence, health problems, and behavioral changes. These reports helped lawmakers understand that widespread availability was creating social and medical challenges. In response, some communities introduced early regulations. These included limiting sales in pharmacies, requiring licenses for sellers, and restricting access to children. Certain cities passed local ordinances that aimed to reduce street-level distribution. Enforcement was still inconsistent, and cocaine products remained available in many homes and stores. But these measures marked the start of formal government intervention. Medical professionals continued their work to observe and understand cocaine use. Hospitals collected detailed case studies of patients with addiction, documenting both physical and mental symptoms. Physicians shared their findings in journals and conferences, helping to build broader awareness. Gradually, these studies influenced doctors to be more cautious in prescribing cocaine and to educate patients about its risks. Public education campaigns began to grow. Religious groups, charitable organizations, and early public health committees provided lectures, pamphlets, and guidance about the dangers of cocaine. Families were encouraged to monitor children, observe symptoms, and limit access to tonics or syrups containing the drug. Schools occasionally participated by sharing warnings about dependence and behavioral effects. pharmacies slowly adapted to the changing environment. Some began limiting quantities, warning customers, or refusing to sell to individuals suspected of repeated overuse. Others continued standard sales practices. Advertising, however, remained strong, emphasizing energy, vitality, and health benefits. This combination of cautious medical practice and ongoing commercial promotion reflected the transitional period before stricter federal regulation. Cocaine's role in society began to shift. While previously seen as a harmless tonic, medicine, or stimulant, the growing awareness of addiction, health consequences, and social disruption made people more cautious. Families and communities increasingly discussed safe use, monitoring children, and avoiding recreational use. Workers and performers began to face growing social pressure to limit consumption. By 1914, this early period of America's first cocaine epidemic was drawing to a close. The widespread, largely uncontrolled availability of cocaine products, along with medical and social experimentation, had given way to increasing regulation and public awareness. The lessons learned during the 1890s and early 1900s shaped later laws, public health campaigns, and the development of modern attitudes toward controlled substances. Even though the epidemic was over a century ago, it remains an important example of how society, medicine, and commerce can interact to shape public health. Observing this history helps us understand the importance of careful regulation, public education, and the role of medical guidance in everyday life. It reminds us that even substances once considered safe can have hidden risks that only become clear over time. If you found this calm, historical story helpful or relaxing, please consider subscribing to the channel for more bedtime histories like this one. And if you enjoyed the narration, giving the video a like helps support these peaceful explorations of history. Thank you for listening, and may your evening remain calm and restful.